and focus more closely on the Indian case, I'll take a number of examples from India, in part because I've done a lot of my research here, but I think it's also because it has relevance to many other parts of the world. Now, while these major sort of the industrial revolutions were going on in the world, most of them happen to be centered around North America, Western Europe, and Japan, right? Now, in the global south, now when I say global south, I'm leaving out anything but North America, Western Europe, and Japan is global south. Now, what happened was that in the World War II era, or soon after World War II, many of these sort of former colonies, especially in Asia and Africa, became independent, and they started to embrace what is called import substitution industrialization, right? They wanted to free themselves from their colonial masters by adopting autarkic, that is inward-looking, public sector-led as opposed to private sector-driven industrialization policies. And these were based either on sort of backward integration, in other words, you start making consumer goods and then you gradually build the equipment that makes these final consumer goods, right? That is the process that was adopted in Latin America. Or you go through a process of forward integration by starting with capital goods. In India, for instance, we took the sort of the opposite route. We said, let's first learn how to build the capital goods, that is the machinery that will make machinery that will finally make consumer goods, rather than starting with consumer goods and then making the heavy machinery finally. But irrespective of the trajectory that was followed or the route that was followed, most of these efforts really came to naught because there were sort of significant limits in terms of developing technology or innovating locally. Of course, there were a few exceptions, such as Embraer in Brazil, or India's generic pharma industry, which is the largest in the world. And a big part of the problem was, of course, because you had very limited markets, right? The local purchasing power was limited, and furthermore, because of very inward-looking policies, you were also not keen to or able to export. And over time, because what you were making was also not very technological advanced, it became even more hard to sort of go into the global market and compete with the most advanced products in the world, whether it came from Europe or from Japan or from North America. So what happened tragically was that many countries continued to remain sources of raw material, or they only joined what became known as a new international division of labor on the basis of low-cost manufacturing. Okay? Essentially, most of the technology and production knowledge lay with the North, the global North, and so the best thing that the South could supply was low-cost labor. Of course, there were some efforts to break away from this through models such as appropriate technologies that were inspired by Schumacher, who in turn was inspired by Gandhi. And this whole appropriate technology movement de-emphasized automation, they de-emphasized scale and capital intensity, all in favor of locally controlled, decentralized, labor-intensive, energy-efficient technologies. But this didn't really gain a sort of acceptance because of limited technical transferability, weak institutional support, and insufficient funding. There was not enough money going to these efforts. There was not enough documentation, IP protection, etc., to be able to say, okay, let's scale. You know, these technologies are very good. So by the 1980s, this had pretty much died a slow death. But while the story was not particularly cheerful in most parts of the global South, and in a certain corner of East Asia, there were some very remarkable changes, right? And I refer here to the so-called four tigers, that is Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, right? And what they did was to undertake this project that has come to be known as late industrialization, okay? A political project where the state subsidized sectors in which it wanted to build a comparative advantage, right? it said, okay, we're going to sort of focus on a few sectors. It also ensured price distortions by combining financial incentives with tariff protection, right? So what it did was, it also said, if you're going to produce domestically, we are going to give ourselves certain financial advantages. So high tariffs, and we're also going to maybe play around with the exchange rates, etc., right? The state also curtailed consumption and invested savings to build education system and infrastructure. So all these countries invested heavily in university, building really first-rate universities. And uniquely in the city-states of Singapore and Hong Kong, they also built a wonderful or an extensive public housing system, which even to this day accommodates at least 70% of the local population. What public housing did was to serve or provide a welfare net to a rapidly growing economy faced with economic uncertainty, right? But here's the difference between, say, most of the other countries of the global south and these four tigers. In exchange for subsidies, whether it was like, tariff protection, or whether it was, distorted exchange rates, the Korean state, for instance, imposed industry performance standards in the form of export targets. In other words, we'll give you a whole bunch of benefits, but go forth and conquer the world, right? We'll help you build a steel industry or a car industry or a textile industry, but you have to go and sell internationally. Don't just focus on the domestic market, because in any case, that market has been very strongly curtailed, right? So what firms did in response was use subsidies to import technology and use it efficiently by world standards in large production facilities to exploit economies of scale and to reverse engineering products and processes. This became known as industrialization by learning. Thus, import the technology, figure out why it works, okay, and then sort of build that and build manufacturing facilities to ensure that you're able to sort of not just replicate that technology, but also improve on it, right? And build it at such a scale so that your costs of production are brought down very significantly. Thus, you take, for example, in South Korea, you have the, POSCO, Pohang Iron and Steel became one of these sort of the most sort of cost-efficient sort of steel producer in the world. And later you have Taiwanese firms becoming some of the most, innovative and low-cost semiconductor producers in the world, all by sort of following the same sort of broad principle, right? Okay. Now, it's the ability to deploy relatively low wage but increasingly well-educated labor that made possible shop floor learning and efficient production to help export a range of low-cost products that relied on borrowed technology. Now, this is a classic instance. So where you have technology that is hardly new. The technology was actually worked out very well in Europe, North America, Japan. You import the technology. But where is the innovation taking place? The innovation is taking place in figuring out how to make those products, how to make a new set of products using existing technology differently, how to organize the firms differently in much larger production facilities than the world had seen, right? And you use low-cost labor, you use very, very well-educated labor, and then you're able to tell the world, I will be able to give you something that is reasonably new as an innovative product. For example, a safer car, right? Or it might be a steel of a particular grade, a particular quality, right? Not new technology, but certainly something that is novel and new, right? All based on borrowed technology, but being sort of organized in a very different fashion. It's a new social division of labor and a new spatial division of labor that was forming in East Asia. Now, among the sort of the relatively disappointing cases in the global south was India, right? Now, although India pursued import substitution industrialization after it became independent from the British in 1947, by the 1980s, India realized that policies were not anywhere as effective as those in East Asia, and increasingly India came under the influence of the Washington Consensus, that is the IMF, the World Bank, and the American sort of Treasury, and sort of embraced liberal economic policies, right? And in this sense, you know, India was not really much of an exception, right? There were many countries who by the 70s, especially when there was a sort of a global slowdown in the economy, were also affected, and like India, they had to go for sort of a bailout to the IMF and the World Bank and say, can you help us, right? We're broke, we don't know what we can do to get out of this mess, and the IMF said, okay, here's what you do. Free markets, greater foreign investment, liberalize your economies, and so on. So in India, an early step that was taken was to modernize a telecommunication infrastructure that was characterized by very poor quality, very low telephone density, and you know, at that time, I remember when I was growing up, even in the 70s and even up to the early 80s, it would take you 10 years before you got a telephone connection from the state telecoms company. So, which is like, you know, 10 years is a fair bit of time. And the quality, of course, is just terrible. Even so, so you wonder what you're really waiting for. But what did happen from about 84, 85 was that reform undertaken with an expatriate Indian, right? A person here, you know, who had worked in the US. He returned after years to establish what became known as the Center for Development of Telematics to develop telephone switching equipment suited to Indian conditions. High call rates, high call volume per line, high sort of temperature, dust and humidity. Because much of the dominant technology in telephone switching until that time was largely sort of stuff that had come out of Europe or North America, where you did not have tropical temperatures. You know, in India, the top temperatures can go up to 45, 46 in the summers. Humidity is very high. It's 98% plus in most of the country, in the summers particularly, and it's very dusty, right? So you don't find much of these conditions in places like Sweden, where Ericsson comes from, or Alcatel, where France comes from, right? Yeah, so what Sam Pitroda, that's the name of the guy who returned to the country, did was to lead the development of technologies with domestic skills, and also conceived of an innovation to improve telephone access by redefining it in terms of distance from a phone rather than in phones per thousand population. Now, typically, when people talk about telephone density, people say, okay, how many phones do you have per thousand population? Now, Pitroda said, given the size of India, I mean, today we are a country of 1.2 billion people, but back then, even then, we were about 700 million people in the 700 to 800 million people in 84, 85. And he said, you're not going to get anywhere near the rates of the advanced industrial countries, but let's rethink, right? And here's where innovation comes in, about how we think about telephone density. If we have to get telephones to people, let's think of it in terms of distance from a telephone rather than density, right? Now, what this meant, it eventually led to the opening up of the telecommunications market. And today, India has the second largest mobile phone subscriber base in the world, right? So, I mean, they're close to 1 billion mobile phones and subscribers in the country. Now, how did that happen, right? To go back to what Pitroda did in terms of redefining sort of telephone density in terms of distance, Pitroda in the late 80s offered sort of about 1 million franchisee operated public call offices with subscriber trunk dialing, that's domestic long distance calling, and international subscriber dialing established across the country, right? Now, the phone booths were also equipped with low cost meters. So you see those sort of meters on the top above the gentleman standing and making a phone call, a little red a meter, which tells you how many seconds you've been speaking for, and below that, how much it is costing you. So let's say you go in with a specific budget, right? I'll speak for so many dollars or pesos or whatever, and you know exactly, okay, I need to convey the message within such and such time. Now, previously we did have telephone booths, but in the absence of these meters, there was always suspicion that the guy who ran the telephone booth was cheating you, right? What Pitroda realized was that having these booths, okay, meant it would improve access, but that you also had to convince your users that they were being given a fair deal. That's the thing. That's the meters. And these are essentially your cab meters, right, which say how many miles you've gone. And essentially it's a modified version of that, very low cost. And the other thing this did in terms of improving access was essentially if you were, lived reasonably close to a phone booth, you could make friends with the guy, and let's say your brother or some family member or friend would call, say, internationally. This guy would tell them, I'll just hang on, I can tell your brother or friend who's here, and then call back later. So the information goes to the person for whom the phone call is made to, and then that person comes to the booth, and then the person calls again, and they can talk. So these are sort of informal social arrangements that became possible, and critically, it improved access to telephony. And of course, now with mobile phones in everybody's pocket, these kinds of booths, these telephone booths are all gone, right? But nevertheless, they were a very, very important sort of means, or both a technological and sort of a technological change, and a sort of a kind of a social innovation that really revolutionized telecommunications in India. And today, what is happening is that because of the availability of mobile phones, what the regulators are trying to do is saying, let's see how much we can push broadband access, right? And so to augment the shortage of Wi-Fi hotspots in the country, we have only about 30,000 versus about 10 million in the US. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India is opening public data offices by partnering with firms such as the Bangalore startup, which is called Wi-Fi Dabba, Wi-Fi Box. Now, these hotspots are located at street side tea stalls and tea shops, and they offer very low denomination Wi-Fi coupons, starting from about 3 cents, 3 American cents, right? So you can buy it, and it allows you to download specific amounts of data, right? So for somebody who's not having a fixed income, because there's a lot of low-income people who work in things like construction and other forms of informal labor who do not have a very steady income. For them, this kind of access to data becomes extremely useful and critical, right? So there have been significant sort of innovations that have been taking place in the country around existing technologies. Most of these don't require technological, big new technologies. Around 84, 85, when Petroda was starting to transform telecom, India also sort of started to wake up to the computing industry and its potential. Specifically, India wanted to become to software what South Korea and Taiwan were to hardware. And the ICT industry in India grew by taking advantage of a large pool of relatively underemployed, English-speaking, and high-skilled, if low-wage scientists and engineers. So we had this sort of pool of really, well-trained engineers and scientists. I mean, India produces the second largest number of engineers in the world after China, trained in English. And at the time in the 1980s, because the economy wasn't doing too well, there were not too many of them with the greatest of jobs, right? And India clearly realized that Taiwan, South Korea, and the East Asia had sort of gone way ahead in the hardware industry. So it said, let's see what we can do with this new thing called software, and let's see if we can take advantage with the skills that we have. So India took advantage of what came to be known as convergence in the ICT industry, as the cost and functional characteristics of virtually any application or device is increasingly determined by software. So whether it's a mobile phone or whether it's a CT scan in a hospital, it's the software that is what is most expensive, right? The hardware is playing an increasingly smaller, accounts for an increasingly smaller proportion of the cost, and most of it is actually software cost. So India said, if software is becoming that important, and that is going to determine the direction the industry is taking, let's go in that direction. Thus, by 2009-10, India became the largest exporter of information and communication technology services. Today, starting from virtually nothing in 1985, in about 35 years, today India exports about $150 or $160 billion of software every year, right? But what happened was, in the early years, at least in the late 1980s, software exports were no more than body shopping, right? And by body shopping, essentially, we're referring to a phenomenon of providing inexpensive on-site labor, that is at customer locations, on an hourly basis for low value added programming services such as coding and testing. And this was really, not even exports. A guy would get an order from a client or a customer in the US, a so-called company. He'd come to India, pick up 50 engineers, and then send them to the customer site. So it was really labor arbitrage, right? It was not really software development because all of that was being determined by the customer himself. These guys are only supplying bodies. That's the name, body shopping. Now, what happened was, quite often, when these engineers went to places like the US or Europe, they realized, these Indian engineers realized, that their skills are not being utilized to the best, right? Best possible extent. And they quite often, therefore, simply quit and moved on to more challenging and better paying jobs. Because when you went in through the body shopping route, you did not necessarily get a great salary, right? But so they jumped and they went to work for the Microsofts and the Intels of the world. But the key sort of change came in 1990 with the establishment of what came to be known as software technology parks, which offered data communication infrastructure and financial incentives to promote software production and utilization of high-skilled labor at home instead of at customer sites, right? So what happened was, see, in India at that time, like I said, in the 1980s, still our sort of telecom infrastructure was really shabby, but the software technology parks established, high-speed data communication exclusively for the software industry. And the key financial incentive was, they said, any profits from software exports would be tax exempt. So it was all cream for you, right? So everybody, it became very, very attractive. And because you could now start you had the infrastructure incentives, people started to develop software at home, in India. So the shift to offshore services in a more liberal economic environment, because, like I said, India had started to sort of adopt the Washington Consensus and move to more liberal policies from the 1980s onwards, there came this new relationship between the Indian software industry and global markets. Firms able to keep were able to keep employees under one roof, and they pioneered what came to be known as a global offshore delivery model in offshore development centers with the infrastructure, technology, productivity tools, and methodologies of the customer workplace. So you had the software technology parks in which firms established themselves and set up all the infrastructure that they needed, all the technologies that were needed, and said, we will do this, what they call, we will do sort of offshore software delivery for customers anywhere in the world, right? It became a 24/7 method of operation, right? And there was a very special focus on adopting industry-wide certification norms, quality norms, specifically the International Standards Organization ISO 9001, 9003 standards, and the Software Engineering Institute's capability maturity model. ISO standards are more popular in Europe. The capability maturity model, the ACI CMM, is more popular in the US. So between the ISO and CMM, the Indian software industry had covered most of the world's large export markets. And indeed, by June 2002, 85 Indian firms or firms in India were certified at level 5, which is the highest CMM level, compared with 42 in the rest of the world put together, right? So more than twice the number of firms elsewhere, you had more than twice the number of firms elsewhere who were certified at level 5. So here's a little map. In 1993, we had about half a dozen software technology parks in different parts of the country, right? Bangalore is right here, for those of you who can see it, right? In the southern part of the country. But this whole sort of policy initiative proved so popular that by 2015 you had 53 centers throughout the country, and you can see it sort of dotting the national landscape, right? The other thing that happened was that, you know, till about the 1990s, India experienced what is called brain drain. Like some of the best and the brightest would leave to destinations in Europe and US for, you know, better professional challenges, and especially this sort of accelerated after US immigration laws were changed in 1965, right? And in the 1990s, however, there was another sort of a change in law which accelerated this kind of process of brain drain, right? What really happened was the US introduced something called the H-1B visa, which essentially made it possible for people in high skill occupations that were in short supply in the US to be fast-tracked through the immigration process, essentially, right? Firms could hire people with specialized skills. And the people who sort of benefited most out of these were software professionals, and most of whom actually came from India. And I'll show you the data very shortly. So through the 1990s, there was a huge number of Indians who, again, sort of who went into the US because of the internet boom in 1993 and the sort of the enormous demand for skilled professionals in the US that local universities were alone not able to fulfill. But what happened was in 2000, 2001, you had the great internet bust, and at that time, you know, many kind of these sort of people who had been on H-1B visas suddenly found themselves without, you know, easy employment opportunity in the US. And because by that time India's reputation as a provider of software for global markets had grown sufficiently, many of those who might have stayed back in the US said, let's go back home and let's see if there are better opportunities, because people are now starting to talk about it, right? So what it did was to establish greater flows back and forth between India and the US, and the brain drain of the previous 35 years started to become a process of brain circulation, as now people started to go more frequently between the US and India, and not just for personal reasons. It was not people coming from the US to visit family. Now they're saying, let me sort of set up operations at a software technology park or something like that and connect to other markets in the US, right? And so you're actually making these sort of trips to also for professional reasons, and in the process, because of your connection in the US, you're also enriching the potential of what Indian skills and Indian firms are able to do. Now, the government, right, also sort of encouraged these flows with something called the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2005 to create a special category called the Overseas Citizen of India for foreign citizens of Indian origin, people who had taken up American nationality, for instance, and they could now live and work in the country indefinitely, and the only thing they could not do was vote or to sort of hold constitutional offices or buy agricultural property. In any case, what this did do was, create what the great UC Berkeley scholar Annalee Saxenian calls Argonauts, who now brought not just skills but also knowledge of global markets. Now, access to such embodied knowledge allowed India to build on software services capability to become a global provider of R&D services, and that has been behind much of the growth in information communication technologies over the past 10 years. It's not just the provision of low-wage, low-cost software services. So here is a sort of a table that shows you how much India benefited from the H-1B visa, right? Now you just see the worldwide admissions, you see the numbers on the very left, and you see this column here, and you see that India in 1994, 16.2% of the H-1B visas in 94 went to Indians. By 2014, it was 43.4%. and throughout India had the #1 rank, right? And when you think about it, and you think that in 2014, about 500,000 H-1B visas were issued, and you say 45% of that, you're actually talking about 250 to 300,000 people who were going, and that's the numbers that were going, and a fair chunk of that actually chose to come home after the internet bust of 2000. And although the numbers continue to go up, many of these people who went on H-1B visas also kept their ears very close to what was going on in India, and this whole process of brain circulation continued, right, to the benefit of the country. All right? Okay. Okay. Now, even as this sort of India's sort of software growth was going on, there were other sort of, in the early 21st century, there were other signs that said, that there was more to all of this, okay? There was sort of growing concern with inequality and collective action problems, such as poverty, climate change, pandemics. You had like the avian flu and all those sorts of things, which led to our collective sort of adoption, first of the Millennium Development Goals, and more recently the Sustainable Development Goals, which we hope to reach by 2030. Now, these are sort of big problems that face the planet as a whole and have required significant political action. Now, for firms, especially the large, sort of the most profitable, the biggest multinational companies, they are faced with another challenge, which is very flat population growth and aging populations in the global north, that is in Japan, North America, and Europe, which limit the opportunities for profitability. For instance, Japan today is a country about 120 million people. It's expected to shrink to about 70 million by 2050, right? And the same holds true for Southern Europe and even North America and other parts of Europe are not exactly growing at a very rapid rate, right? Attention then at that time slowly started to shift to the global south as markets. Thus far, most of the global south was either, initially, in the during the colonial days or the days after colonialism was over, the global south merited attention primarily as a source of raw material first, and then later on as a site of production with low-cost labor and low-wage labor, low-skilled labor, right? But now for the first time, there was now this sudden shift to saying, maybe these guys are global markets too, because the vast majority of the population on the planet actually lives in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And the attention shifted particularly to a segment of the population known as the bottom of the pyramid, or the BOP, a population that earns, say, less than $2 a day, and whose numbers are estimated at about 4 billion, right, worldwide. Now, obviously, given the sort of the affordability of this population, they have very few sort of goods and services. They barely have enough to eat, but and that potentially makes them a large market. Oh, these people don't have anything. Let's give them some really fancy stuff that we are no longer able to sell in, say, Europe or North America. But that initial optimism died very quickly because the design of products and services for BOP is very demanding. Okay? Much of this population lives in areas where the physical infrastructure like electricity or roads is extremely unreliable, assuming it even exists. There's, of course, the problem of disposable income. There is widespread illiteracy, right? People can't necessarily read and write. And of course, you can't talk of this population of 4 billion, that's the BOP population, as a homogeneous mass. There's enormous sociocultural diversity. A person who is earning less than $2 a day in the sort of in Latin America is hardly similar to a person or sort of has similar tastes and behaves in the same way as somebody who earns less than $2 a day in India. And of course, there's wide variation within Latin America, just as there's wide variation within India. Now, what it also means is that there's a need, therefore, to go beyond localization or providing stripped-down versions from affluent markets, right? In other words, you can't just say, oh, you know, I made something for $10 in the US. I will take out a few features and sell the same product for $2 in, say, India or in some other part of the world. It doesn't work that way, right? Because you are assuming that the basis, the design axioms on which that product was designed for North America or Europe or Japan is also valid for the BOP population. But people learned the hard way that that's not how it works, right? So what it instead calls for is a combination of asset exploitation, that is use of existing technologies, with asset seeking, that is technology creating basic research. So in other words, yes, on one hand, you can use certain things that you already know. Okay, there's no need to reinvent the wheel for everything. But at the same time, given the specific characteristics of this population you are trying to address, you do need to figure out a whole new set of things that you've so far been unaware of, right? You need to do some basic research, you need to understand this population and so on, and then combine your existing assets with new assets. Now, one of the reasons why the so-called BOP is extremely hard to design for is that those of you in marketing will know that when you're launching a new product, you typically rely on a lead user, right, who are reasonably familiar with the product, and then you give them the next generation, you give them a prototype, they will tell you, you know, what's good, what's not so good, try and incorporate that feedback, and then only release the commercial version of the product. But the problem is, while in sort of well-developed markets, you have very well-defined lead users that you can stratify by age, you can say teenagers, middle-aged people, old people, etc., who have different approaches to using technology. Lead users in the BOP segment are very hard to define, in large part because they've had very little exposure to technology at all in the first place, right? So what happens is you don't have a set of lead users that you can fall back on and test your products, right? It's not that easy. In order to overcome this problem, we came up with this notion of frugal innovation. And that was actually inspired by the term frugal engineering, which was first used by the former Nissan Renault CEO, Carlos Ghosn. Now, frugal innovation is not only about cutting costs, but it must be, you must have sort of robust and easy to use products and services. It's about significantly improved products, processes, marketing or organizational methods that minimize the use of material and financial resources in the complete value chain. That is development, manufacturing, distribution, consumption, and disposal, with the objective of reducing the cost of ownership while fulfilling or even exceeding certain predefined criteria of acceptable quality standards. Now, what this sort of definition by two German professors indicates is that frugal innovation is far from easy. There are a lot of demands made on it, right? So to meet such sort of demanding standards, frugal innovation must draw on diverse sources of explicit and tacit knowledge about the lives and circumstances that have so far merited little attention. So far the BOP has been ignored. Nobody cared for the poor. Suddenly you want them to sit up and say, hey, we'll be consumers. That's not going to happen. So what it has meant is the need for research, design, and production locations in the global south for learning by interacting. So we are moving now to learning by interacting, where you're actually interacting very closely with the consumer. And this is a big jump from the learning by doing that the Koreans and the Taiwanese had practiced successfully in the 1960s and 70s. Times have changed. So our innovation policies and approaches have to change. Now, India is sort of a very important site for frugal innovation for a number of reasons. Because, India is first of all at 1.2 billion people with 17 national languages and 512 other languages. It's a very diverse country socially and culturally, and at least about 40% of our population lives in conditions of poverty and illiteracy amidst inadequate infrastructure. So in one sense, it's a great site. But that alone is not enough, because there are many parts of the world that are poor. But what makes India unique is the pool of technical skills that is available to design and deploy ICTs to address the challenges of the BOP population. And the existence of this pool of the skills has been proven with the success of the software industry. Furthermore, India is, it's sort of the world's largest democracy. We are a flawed democracy, but we're still the world's largest, right? India is sort of has a thriving civil society with a range of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which try to compensate for states' inadequate provision of social and physical infrastructure. So you see NGOs working in the area of medical care, education, and so on and so forth. And what they do really is, from the point of view of firms, they provide last-mile connectivity to BOP markets, because NGOs work very closely with the underprivileged sections of society. The government, for its part, there's been has been sort of pushing this sort of inclusiveness agenda, right, for the last 10 years. And as part of that, it modified the Companies Act in 2013 and mandated that firms spend at least 2% of their net profits on activities explicitly identified by a corporate social responsibility policy, right? So you essentially have to spend 2% of profits on, this applies to only firms of a certain size, but nevertheless, they've been told you have to spend on CSR, and this CSR must be towards social upliftment. It can't be just another means of pushing your own products. State policy has sort of further incentivized firms to deploy the skills in India with the knowledge of that, and the knowledge of that can come from working with NGOs, right? And it sort of forced firms to say, okay, now let's turn to NGOs so that we're able to sort of gain a better idea of the kinds of products and services that we can provide the underserved. So while working with sort of CSR on one hand, it also, and the CSR sort of activities are primarily meant for social upliftment, it also gives firms an understanding and insight into some of the things that segment of the population might need, right? So it allows them, on one hand, to do social good, but on the other hand, to also gain insights into developing products and services that the BOP population will need. Now, because of these sort of changed relationships, what you actually see is, if you look at how sort of firms and sort of NGOs interact, you see there's a very hard line. So typically, donors would come to a school or a hospital previously, just write a big check and walk away. So if you go to a school, this is taken from a school outside Bangalore, you find some very, very well-known names like Cisco and Digital and 3M and all these big companies. They already made a donation. But this is on the basis of somebody's whim. More recently, however, you see the blurring of boundaries. So you see, for instance, here on the left, the very top, Intel Foundation and Intel Bangalore. One is the CSR wing, another is the company itself. Then you see Cisco Foundation, Cisco Networks, Microsoft Research. You see MIT Media Lab, the National University of Singapore, the University of Agricultural Sciences, Asha Foundation USA. So you see the coming together of NGOs, firms, the government, the Tamil Nadu government, the government of Karnataka, which are all sort of states within the country, coming together to work collectively to solve the problems. This is again a manifestation of blurred boundaries to address the needs of the underprivileged. Now, let me sort of give you a couple of examples here, right? And this is, the first example that I'll start off with is Microsoft Research and the multi-point mouse, right? Now, Microsoft Research established MSR, or Microsoft established Microsoft Research, MSR, in Bangalore in 2005. And this center had this sort of unique technology for emerging markets group to address local needs by working with external partners, including NGOs and governments. Now, if you look at it, Microsoft Research is located in about 13 parts of the world, has 13 labs across the world. But India is the only location where they have a technology for emerging markets group. They also have other sort of computer science and engineering groups, like in their other labs across the world. But this group, the Technology for Emerging Markets group, which includes sociologists, anthropologists, and people like that, is unique to India and to the center in Bangalore. Now, one of the challenges that they sort of decided to address about, this is almost a decade ago, was, you know, in a country where you have a very high student to PC ratio, right? In other words, you have far more students than PCs. The idea of a personal computer is meaningless because everything is, you know, you have 20 people running after a single computer. So that's not personal, right? Especially in schools. Because of affordability, government schools don't have the money, and so on. So in order to sort of improve or increase interactivity for all children huddled around a PC, Microsoft Research came up with a multi-point mouse, or multiple mice with multiple cursors attached to a single machine, thus enabling at least half a dozen students or children to share a PC. And I'll show you a photograph in a minute in the next slide. Right? Essentially, for all of us who use a PC, whether it's a laptop PC or whatever, you have a mouse that there's one mouse to the machine, and then you move it around, and then you sort of use it as you see fit or as necessary. But what they did was they essentially said, what if many, many kids can actually have access to this, so that you share that resource, right? Now, multi-point mouse goes beyond cost savings. As studies showed that learning outcomes from competitive and collaborative lessons are as effective with a single PC per child. In other words, they did research after designing this multi-point mouse, and they found out that more than just the cost saving of saying, let's say instead of giving 6 children 6 different PCs, you allow them to share the machine, more than just cost savings, the ability to work together improves learning outcomes, right? This is studies done by psychologists and anthropologists. Now, Bill Gates refers to the design of such products and services for the unique needs of poorer or less affluent countries as creative capitalism, right? Now, here it is. Now, if you see the photograph on the left on the top, you see this one kid who has the cursor in his hand, and children around him standing and saying, you do this, and they're all sort of egging him along and cheering him along, right? And the others are just, oh, you know, this girl is simply watching because she can't do anything with the laptop. But on the other hand, with a multi-point mouse, you see all these 4 kids having a mouse and sharing the same machine. So what this allows them to do is to play games together, do some kind of learning together. And interestingly enough, right, this innovation traveled even to the US, to their poorer inner city neighborhoods, not because students there lack access to PCs, but because of the gains from collaborative learning that this kind of innovation from a pre-existing technology can offer, right? And in the case of this particular school, and you know where actually Microsoft came up with this idea, these are actually poorly funded government schools. And so the government sort of had earlier approached a non-profit agency to run the schools on its behalf. And so Microsoft then started with working with this non-profit organization. So really what happens is that you have a government school run by a non-profit for which this sort of new innovation is developed by a multinational company. Private sector, not-for-profit sector, and the public sector. Once again, a case of blurred boundaries. And sort of learning by interacting and seeing how kids use computers in order to develop innovations for them. I'll give you another example in the area of health. There's a big non-profit called World Health Partners in the northern state of sort of Bihar, which is actually India's poorest state. Physical isolation, weak public health infrastructure, and poor regulation in many parts of rural India force people to depend on private practitioners. So the people who need public health care the most are the ones who end up spending the most amount of money on private doctors and private medical care, which is very tragic. And many of these sort of so-called private doctors are really quacks. They are neither qualified nor certified to provide treatment, right? And they basically take illiterate rural people for a ride. Now, like I said, the lack of health insurance means high out-of-pocket expenses, which also inhibits the adoption of cost-effective preventive care measures, right? So your nutrition is bad, and so on and so forth. So those sorts of, preventive care is also not possible because you're not able to afford those steps. And your health insurance is also limited to non-existent. So what happened was this NGO, that's World Health Partners, designed a telemedicine program that relies on existing social and economic infrastructures, local market forces, and new medical and communication technologies to scale up and to be cost effective. So they said, we'll work with the existing network, we won't do anything new, but we'll just bring in this sort of new technologies and we'll sort of reorganize the entire network of medical care. So what the program does, it provides health and family planning services through branded internet-based healthcare service franchises, which are linked to central medical facilities in urban areas staffed by doctors. So these internet-based health service franchises are often run by people who have no medical knowledge, right? But what they now do is that because they're connected through the internet, they call up a doctor in a major city, at a major hospital, and get the necessary advice. So like I will show you in a photograph in the next slide, the patient sits in front of the camera. The person who runs the franchise asks certain questions, and they have a discussion with the doctor, and then the doctor tells them, what steps to take, what should be done next, what medicines, etc. Now the franchisee can initiate a service by calling the central facility. Now the rural provider facilitates diagnosis between the doctor and the patient. He mediates, he or she, using a remote diagnostic tool comprised of a computer with internet connection and a webcam, which is also designed to collect basic data such as blood pressure, heart rate, and pulse, right? So all the basic medical parameters are collected using this diagnostic tool. So here you see the lady on the right is the patient, the lady on the left is the franchisee. She is not a doctor, but you can see in front of them a PC, a camera, a printer, and what happens is the franchisee calls the hospital, she mediates between the doctor there and this patient, finds out what's wrong, then they come up with the sort of the diagnostic, recommendations, and see, for instance, here some of these the diagnosis is often printed out, right, and given to the person. But of course, the patient may be illiterate. So what happens is that you also have to then figure out how to get medicines or reports from pathology labs. Suppose you need a blood test. Suppose you need some other kind of test. So in order to do that, in the rural areas, they've also established these mobile diagnostic tests and mobile pharmacies. So which will come at specified times to the villages, and if you're a patient, you actually you give the diagnosis to the person who will then come back, take your test if necessary, and then come back either the next day or whenever, give you back the results of the test, give you the medicines, and then once you're done with your treatment, you go back to the franchise and then you again discuss with the doctor. So essentially, without breaking the rural social networks, right, and without breaking sort of the local sort of, what shall I say, opportunities, economic opportunities that people have, this NGO has managed to refashion healthcare delivery, right? The interesting thing here are the internet franchises are called Sky. That's the brand name here. What's important is to understand that for those of us who are from more educated urban backgrounds, the use of quacks, that is people who are neither certified nor licensed to be a part of this kind of treatment is something that's almost shocking. But whether we like it or not, in many parts of rural India, and I know in many other parts of the world too, these local quacks are the people that the locals will trust, right? There's a long-held social relationship. So if you don't include them in this process of healthcare delivery, the whole effort might be doomed. So you have this sort of, so what the NGO did was to incorporate them. So you have clinics that are, like I said, complemented by a network of reliable pathology laboratories, which are connected to local pharmacies, so that patients get test results and their medicines in one location, instead of traveling long distances to the laboratory to collect results. The service added motorcycle delivery of medicines to remote areas as last mile provision. Right? Now, the networking existing rural healthcare providers, including the unqualified people, ensures a service built on established trust, while rural providers reinforce legitimacy and branding through the network and improve the quality of healthcare service. So for a person who's also a quack to say, oh, I'm a part of this brand, it also puts some pressure on him or her to deliver better quality service, right? So it works sort of both ways, for the patient and for the franchisee. Now the services are mostly subsidized for the population because it's relatively poor, either by the government, the state of Bihar, or by other donors such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and so on. And the Gates Foundation in particular focuses on patients with tuberculosis, diarrhea, and pneumonia, because in that part of the country, those are the most sort of the diseases that take the most toll on the lives of people. Now the program started in 2008 and reached 2 million rural residents by 2011. By January 2014, its network had 600 health centers, 4,700 care providers, 35 clinics, 21 diagnostic centers, 10,000 pharmacies, and all connected to 30+ doctors around the country. By 2014, a pilot project was also launched in Kenya with 18 facilities and 100 mobile providers. Now, the interesting thing about both the Microsoft, the multiple mouse example, and this case, which is actually the World Health Partners, the Rural Health Franchises case, is that what we're witnessing today is a slight change in the direction of innovation flows, right? About how we now think about innovation. Earlier, it used to be that innovations, you look at the graph on the top left, right? Innovations would come from the US, they'd be produced locally, and then after some time when production stabilized, when domestic markets were met, production would move to international markets, primarily places like Europe, right? And production would take place there to meet the local needs. And it would move to sort of less developed or less affluent countries only much later. To the extent that any production moved there at all, it was only to take care of low-wage production. There was not much consumption itself there, right? But this is now starting to change, right? Innovations that in both the cases that we had here, the multi-point mouse and the World Health Partners case, innovations are taken to other countries with similar problems, including to the US, as in the multi-point mouse example. A phenomenon that we broadly refer to as now reverse innovation. That is, it changes the historical direction of innovation flows that Raymond Vernon, who was a professor of business at Harvard University, once described. So you have a situation where we typically relied on new technologies, new innovation, new products and services to come from the advanced industrial countries, the US, Europe, Japan. But now, given the size of the markets, given the unique nature of problems that we see in the global south, these and the increasing availability of skills also, we see that increasingly, we are also generating new products, new processes, new innovations, and ultimately new technologies, right, to serve the world, and that the world is now becoming a much more interesting place with technologies and all these ideas flowing back and forth across different parts of the world, true globalization, if you will, rather than merely sort of trickling down from the advanced industrial countries. And some concluding thoughts. Ultimately, see, the goal of technological change and innovation is productivity improvement and improving the standards of living in a society. Otherwise, it's really of no use. Now, technological change is a necessary but not sufficient condition for innovation. Yes, we need technology, but it is ultimately the diffusion of technology that leads to innovation. And as we see in these examples of Microsoft research, or even in the case of the internet, and the case of open source software, many social actors actually influence that process, the process of diffusion, right? So technology is one thing, diffusion is something else, and that is how we get innovation. Innovation is about many ways in which actors use technology in their lives. It is multi-scalar, right? Cutting across organizations and sectors, and thus the need for policy support. We need to make sure that ideas are kept flowing. We cannot keep them locked up. So the key to innovation is the free flow of ideas so that different actors are able to combine and recombine them in different ways, right? So with that, I think the presentation comes to an end. Thank you so much for your attention and time, and I look forward to being able to discuss some of these ideas with you at a time that Andrea will probably determine, and I'll stay in touch with her. Good luck, and thank you for listening to me.